With me today is Dr. Mark Long, the new Dean of the University of California, Riverside's School of Public Policy. He was previously the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. His area of focus includes education policy, educational attainment, and the effects of affirmative action policies. Dean Long, it's an honor to have a chance to speak with you today.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and I am enjoying my first couple weeks here at UCR.
That's fantastic. So affirmative action, a pressing issue, an issue that's been talked about in American politics for a very long time. Before we get into the weeds of it, I was hoping you can maybe outline some of the history of affirmative action. What are the roots of it? What role have colleges played in affirmative action policy? Can you maybe outline some of the major points in history and how we kind of ended up where we are today?
Yeah, so affirmative action, as we know it, started coming out of the 1960s from the Kennedy administrations, from the Johnson administrations, and you start to see colleges start to take up that cause coming out of the civil rights movement to see themselves as having a mission to serve the public, and particularly responding to the effects of slavery, the effects of segregation, and how that was still influenced particularly Black Americans' lives. But then over time also consideration for Hispanics, Native Americans came, and the injustices that had been done over centuries to those groups started to percolate into colleges as a part of their mission, a social justice part of their mission to try to undo any kinds of contemporary discrimination or prior discrimination that was having contemporary effects. So what you see is, and one of the things that I've done in my research is I've looked at the extent of affirmative action as of 1972, 1982, 1992, with three sort of cohorts of data from the U.S. Department of Education. And what you see by that point is that there were affirmative action and admissions in 1972 in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, not in the South. As of 1972 in the South, if you were a Black, Hispanic, or Native American student who was, if you were relative to a comparable white student, you were actually less likely to be admitted into the selective universities. So you can see active levels of discrimination in the South as of 1972. But by 1982, all of the regions of the United States were practicing some degree of affirmative action, positive affirmative action, increasing the chance of Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. Henceforth, I'll just describe that as underrepresented students to get admitted. You see about the same levels of affirmative action by 1992. But in the 1990s, we saw a number of states ban affirmative action. California was one of those, started with the UC Regents, but then also was passed by a voter initiative to ban affirmative action. You saw a similar effort in Washington State, which is where I just recently came from. There was an effort by then Governor Jeb Bush in Florida and the Florida regents to drop their affirmative action. And then a number of states in the subsequent years. Texas had their affirmative action banned by a court decision, the Hopwood decision. And so there have been these decisions along the way that have affected the ability of states to do affirmative action. Subsequently, what we've seen is the states where there have been bans, we've seen them try to use alternative means for boosting their underrepresented minority composition of their admitted and enrolled students. And I think we can talk about whether those alternative programs have been effective.
Yeah, definitely. One interesting thing to me is the debate about affirmative action is so ongoing, and like you mentioned, your research, how you focus since 1972, and how it's evolved, the bans that happened in the 90s. One thing I wanted to focus on as well, and I think it's important, and you kind of touched on this, is on the effect it's had on underrepresented populations. So, how critical is affirmative action in terms of underrepresented populations being admitted into colleges? There are some that claim it's necessary, some claim the effect is less, or the importance is less. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what you can look at is, if you look at cohort-based sort of measures of, like, for example, test scores, there are large gaps in test scores between, for example, white and Black youth. those test scores, those gaps are there, they're present as of kindergarten. So a lot of this is, clearly things that are going on in the homes, in the communities of these students before they even hit high school. Those gaps, they don't change much during K through 12, and so that then creates an issue for the colleges, which is if they want to have a class that is representative of their state, and this is a particularly important issue for state public universities, they're dealing with gaps in the test scores, they're dealing with gaps in grades, they're dealing with gaps in other measures of academic preparation. And so if they want to be representative, they have to try to do something to try to boost those admissions prospects. The way affirmative action has been traditionally conducted is to directly give some degree of bonus to students who are underrepresented. So in the case that percolated up to the Supreme Court, there were two cases at the University of Michigan related to the undergraduate admissions and the law school admissions. These are the Grutter and Gratz cases. And what University of Michigan was doing at the undergraduate level is that for all Black, Hispanic, and Native American students, they were giving a bump of 20 points in their admissions packet. Now, what does 20 points mean? 20 points is the same as you'd get if you increased your high school graduation grade point average from a 3.0 to a 4.0, or from a 2.0 to a 3.0. So it was a pretty sizable advantage. Now, they were also giving that same 20-point advantage to students who attended predominantly high schools that were composed of predominantly underrepresented minority students. So if you were a white student attending a high school in parts of Detroit where most of the students are Black, you would get the same 20 points. They also gave 20 points if you were from an underrepresented Michigan county. That tended to be the Upper Peninsula that's predominantly white. And there was also 20 points for provost selected candidates, which we don't know what that was. But my bottom line point here is that this was a substantial advantage given to underrepresented students. In the data that I've looked at nationally, if you were applying to the most selective colleges, it would increase, if you were Black, Hispanic, and Native American, it would increase your chance of being admitted by about 30 percentage points. So that's a sizable increase. So in these states, to give actually more specific cases, and some other data I used from Texas, University of Texas and Texas A&M, your chances of being admitted increased by about 15 percentage points. And so it's a kind of substantial increase in your chance of being admitted over an observably similar white student.
That's really interesting. One thing you were talking about, so in terms of it going back to kindergarten or pre-K, the disadvantages that certain populations face, like compared to white students and children, if you're making that policy in terms of trying to figure out, what that advantage is and actually trying to put that, to terms in the law. So, you mentioned the 20-point bonus, which was a substantial increase that was given. So how does that process look like when it comes to saying, there's this disadvantage that exists, and so in order to bring these underrepresented, impacted populations up to par with white students, how does that policy come to play? Because I think one part of the debate about affirmative action that I've also seen isn't necessarily that there are those who are directly opposed to it, but then there are those who are opposed to or are concerned about how effective it is, with some wanting more bonuses given out, and some wanting others wanting less, and not necessarily being completely opposed to the idea in general. So what are your thoughts on the policymaking process in terms of how those advantages are given out? Like, for example, the GPA boost that you explained, the 20-point. There may be some that might say, "Hey, that's too much of a boost." Some may say that it's maybe still not enough. So how does that, in the policymaking process, how does that work? From a data perspective, and also the actual policy coming into fruition.
Yeah. So I think there's two aspects of that question I think that should be addressed. One is, if you look at the extent of representation given affirmative action, at least as practiced by universities, the colleges were still vastly underrepresented, the most selective campuses. So like if you look at UC Berkeley, for example, it does not match the composition of the state in terms of their Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. That was true in the early 90s before affirmative action was banned across the UC campuses. So if the goal of that process was to create representation, you could argue that they were not doing enough. The other thing I think that's important to think about here is, when I was talking about those test score gaps that are emerging before kids get into kindergarten, you might ask the question, well, why is that? So if you look at then gaps in all kinds of different measures, whether that's income, wealth, imprisonment, having a job, having two parents, a lot of these differences are there to begin with. And so some say, well, let's actually not use affirmative action based on race. Let's directly give advantage to students who are poor, to students who don't have or whose parents don't own a home, who have different less wealth. So some people say, look, we don't need affirmative action based on race. We need affirmative action based on income or socioeconomic status. What you can show there is if you try to, if your goal is representation by race, but you use other indicators like income or wealth, you need to put as much as 4 times as much weight on those other factors that you would if you just put weight directly on race. So one of the questions there becomes then, from an efficiency perspective, if what you're interested in is generating racial representation, it's inefficient to put weight on socioeconomic status. It will get you there, but you have to put much more emphasis on it to get to the same point. On the other hand, some people say, look, it's improper, immoral for the state to take into account a person's race, whereas it's not immoral or unjust or inappropriate to be discriminatory based on income, let's say. So they'll say, okay, even if it's inefficient, we feel more comfortable putting weight on race. And I think that's a reasonable argument. I know I'm kind of going on at length with this question, but one more thing to say about this. In the 1978 Supreme Court decision, Bakke versus the University of California, in the subsequent Grutter and Gratz cases that came out of the University of Michigan, what the courts have held is that states have to try all race-neutral alternatives, all workable race-neutral alternatives. And there's an interesting tension in that phrase, workable race-neutral alternative. So what the court is saying is, you have to try all things like putting weight on socioeconomic status, as long as that's workable. So what does workable mean? Well, workable basically means so long as it doesn't have too much of a negative effect on the operations of the campus. So you could make an argument, or a university could make an argument, look, we tried all these other ways, and particularly if we're going to put emphasis on income, we would have to put so much emphasis on income that we would draw in a class of students that aren't academically capable of succeeding in the classroom. And so it's not workable to go that far. So I think that's where the inherent tension is right now in the Supreme Court's decisions and in how colleges are responding to it.
That's really interesting, and that case is especially interesting. One thing I wanted to ask really briefly was, you mentioned income and wealth as indicators. That could work if you put much more emphasis on them. Are there any other indicators besides race that are worth talking about in this context, or are those two the other main ones that people kind of discuss?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So one way of thinking about this question, and the way I've thought about this question, is if ultimately what you're trying to do is put weight on things that are proxies for race, that are predictive of race, what you could do is you could take all the factors, all the data that the colleges collect, take that data to predict the likelihood that an applicant is an underrepresented minority, and then put weight on that predicted likelihood. So when I was talking about you'd have to put 4 times as much weight on that, that's exactly what I was talking about. And the paper that I did on this, it was published in the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, and it was trying to assess this question of, is it workable? Is there a race-neutral alternative that's workable? When I presented this paper, though, to people who were lawyers, particularly lawyers who are on the sort of pro-affirmative action side of the debate, they got very nervous and concerned with the use of the term proxy, because in other Supreme Court decisions, what they've said is that, particularly in employment law, that it's not legally permissible to put weight on a decision that is a proxy for race in an effort to be discriminatory. So in other words, let's say I have a test that I give, and that test has no connection to a person's job performance or ability to perform on the job, but I think that there's going to be a difference in the outcomes based on race. And so then I use that test in a backhanded way to discriminate. The courts have said you can't do that. So you can't use proxy indicators for race to try to be discriminatory. So in the same way, they get concerned that universities would use a proxy system for race. And so what the kind of conditions that creates then is that the universities have an incentive to not describe what they're doing with affirmative action for socioeconomic status. They have to be careful to say we're not trying to do that as a proxy for race. We're doing it because we care about helping low-income students directly. And in fact, it may be true that the universities, I'm sure it's true, and I know it's true at UCR, that they want to help low-income students. But there's this other motive, and I think it's hard to disentangle this, that universities recognize that helping low-income students is more likely to also help their racial representation. And so the lawyers would be cautious about saying that that's a proxy because of this legal history. But as an academic, I can kind of imagine if you tried to take that proxy idea to its extreme, what would you do? And ultimately what that means is taking all the factors that you could possibly obtain and predicting the likelihood that a student is the student is Black, Hispanic, or Native American. One more thing to say about that. I did that same kind of exercise with a really detailed, rich data set that had hundreds and hundreds of variables. And essentially what I was doing is trying to say, how well can you predict someone's race? And I found you can do pretty well, but only if you have data that universities are unlikely to have, and also data that would be hard to collect in this context. So for example, one thing I found is that the single predictor that was most likely to predict whether you were Black, Hispanic, or Native American is if your best friend was Black, Hispanic, or Native American. And the second best predictor was whether your second best friend was Black, Hispanic, or Native American. And the third best was whether your home language was Spanish. So that gives you an idea that, okay, home language is Spanish is probably something they could collect on an application form, but you couldn't collect information on what's the race of your best friend, right? It would be so obviously transparent how you were using it. It would lead to like students on their application not being truthful. So yes, you can predict race, but you can't predict race perfectly particularly with the kinds of data that universities have at hand.
That's really interesting, talking about like what is predictive of race. I mean, hypothetically or theoretically, if somehow there was an indicator that was super, you could super easily collect the data on, universities can, and would also predict race really accurately, but could also, similar to how socioeconomic status is being used now, you can kind of explain it in other terms. It could be a different angle, but it sounds like it's pretty difficult to come across something that's both something that universities could collect and also something that you can kind of get away with in terms of saying, hey, we actually care about this group of people, but in reality, there might be other motives like you were talking about. It's really interesting because I think the indicators and the predictability of race based on other factors, or like you mentioned, proxies, is a really fascinating topic on its own. Getting back to affirmative action specifically, you mentioned the University of California versus Bakke decision. Can you kind of talk about the impact of that case? What was the case about, and also how are its effects still being felt today?
Yeah, so that case was specifically about UC Davis's medical school. And the way UC Davis's medical school, this was the decision was in 1978, the Supreme Court decision. So the way that the medical school in the 70s was doing their admissions is essentially they had a fixed number of slots, and they were reserving a fixed number of slots for white applicants and a fixed number of slots for non-white applicants. And so what that meant, and then they were completely doing their admissions of those two groups separately. The court ruled in a split decision, a 4-1-4 decision, which we'll come back to. They ruled that it was unconstitutional to have separate admission systems, so that you had to have a single admission system. But more importantly, that 4-1-4, the way the 4-1-4 decision worked was there were 4 justices that were in favor of the constitutional permissibility of using race in admissions. There were 4 justices that were opposed to using race in admissions. And the one Justice Powell wrote the deciding decision. He was in favor of affirmative action in part and against it in part. So in terms of being in favor in part, he said that that the universities could continue to use affirmative action if one of two things were true. One, if they had their own recent history of clearly discriminatory practices. So I mentioned in the 1970s that in 1972, you could see that some of the Southern colleges were actively discriminating. If you could show that there was a history of active discrimination, then you were legally permitted under the Powell decision to use race-based affirmative action to sort of undo your own adverse actions. But Powell said you can't use social justice as an argument for your affirmative action. So in other words, universities can't use as a rationale for their admissions that they're trying to benefit society and undo any contemporary effects of either current discrimination by citizens or past discrimination or sort of, segregation and Jim Crow and these kinds of actions. They can't undo bad actions that society has done. However, they can use diversity as a rationale. So what Powell had in mind is that he says, look, there are benefits to having a diverse class of students, and those benefits flow to all students, including white students. So if a university can say that we are using race-based affirmative action because we want to generate a diverse class of students, that can be a permissible use of affirmative action. And so that was 1978. In the subsequent years, then you see diversity as the rationale that universities do use. So, we have lots of DEI committees. Where did that D part come from? I would say arguably it was, not came from, but it was definitely enhanced by Powell's decision, because now that is the language that universities can use to justify their practices. So you don't see universities using the language of, you don't even see them using the language of representation or underrepresentation or trying to fix underrepresentation directly because it potentially could get a challenge to their affirmative action system that they're implementing.
That's really interesting, and the impact of the case, still being talked about today. So as we near the end of the episode, I think one interesting topic to kind of talk about, and maybe this is a bit more open-ended, is, how much does all of this actually matter? What are the, in terms of, there's a lot of groups since the 70s and 60s and today as well that really care about affirmative action because there's a belief that, hey, it's important for underrepresented populations to match white students in terms of college attendance because of the long-term impact. So, does any of this actually have, is that true? Does attendance in these selective colleges actually matter? Or maybe, is it more semantics? Is the impact not as big as some claim?
Yeah, so there's sort of a hotly contested literature among labor economists about what's the effect of additional education, just like a year of additional education, and what's the effect of going to a more selective college. Mm-hmm. And the challenges for that literature is that we don't have good ways of doing experiments to find out. So we can't experimentally assign you years of education, and we don't typically randomly assign students admission to or not admission to universities to see what effects, and then trace out what effects it had in their subsequent lives. So we don't investigate it the same way like a drug manufacturer might do with a randomized controlled trial. However, that said, I would say sort of the best evidence is that every additional year of education that one obtains raises your lifetime earnings by about 7% per year. So it's, each additional year, and that's cumulative, raises your earnings. Secondly, on the college admissions side, again, it's challenging to study, but I believe that the bulk of the evidence is strongly suggestive that going to a more selective college raises your earnings. Now, I should say, you should be skeptical anytime you look at, what are the earnings of the average Princeton student, and then compare it to what are the average earnings of a student at Southwest Missouri State. Why? Because those students have different inputs. They have different test scores, they have different parental characteristics, they have different networks that are coming from their parents and the wealth of their parents. And so that's what makes it so challenging. Nonetheless, the best empirical studies do show that there's a substantial increase in your earnings going to a more selective college. And one way you can study that, for example, is you can look at in schools that have a system where if you where they score the applicants and they admit students based on that score. You can look at the jump in earnings at that threshold of being admitted versus not being admitted. In some studies looking that, can show that admission to a selective flagship institution might raise your lifetime earnings by 20%. So it does matter. And then finally, coming back to the years of education, attendance at more selective colleges also increases your likelihood of graduating from that college. So there's much higher graduation rates at the more selective colleges than at the less selective colleges. And so there's a pretty strong evidence that having a peer group that is more likely to graduate, also having a peer group that themselves have better networks from their family and friends is going to give students an advantage. So yes, it matters.
Yeah, definitely. And I like how you mentioned in the beginning that it's kind of hard to experiment on this, especially because there can be so many extraneous factors and variables. Like a student who attends an Ivy League probably most likely had a different upbringing versus someone who attended, like you said, Southwest Missouri State, and that could have an effect on their lifetime earnings. So it's not just the school the university they attend, but then also, like you mentioned, the university they attend does also have an impact. So it's just kind of a jumble of variables and factors making it really difficult to figure out. But I think it's ultimately still really important to recognize that even though those other variables do play a role, college attendance does in fact have a positive impact in general on your lifetime earnings. Dean Long, that's all the time we have today to speak about affirmative action. I feel like we can have this conversation for 2 more hours and we still wouldn't get to everything we can. It was an honor to have you on the podcast today, and I'm looking forward to your deanship at the SPP.
Thank you. The honor was mine. The honor was shared, and I appreciate the great questions you asked me. Thank you.